Hello, everyone. Thank you for making time for this to attend Notable Needhamites today. I'm Carol Thomas, one of 7 trustees of the Needham Free Public Library. This is the first of the 2022 lectures in the MacIver series presented annually by the trustees of the Needham Library in honor of former library director Vivian MacIver. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Gloria Greis, who may be familiar to many of you from her regular feature articles in the Needham Times. Perhaps for you, as with me, these articles are eagerly anticipated and much enjoyed, shedding a historical perspective on all things Needham history. A bit more about our speaker. Gloria Greis has been executive director of the Needham History Center and Museum since June 2002. Prior to Needham, she was Peabody Research Fellow at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard and collections manager for the Peabody's archaeology and human osteology collections. Wow. She holds a PhD in anthropology, specializing in the archaeology of prehistoric Europe. Gloria is the author of several books and films on archaeology and local history, and of numerous articles and a blog on history, archaeology, and various other topics. She is an elected fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society and a member of the Massachusetts State Historic Records Advisory Board. In Needham, she's a member of the Needham Historical Commission, co-president of the Great Hall Performance Foundation, and an advisory trustee of the N.C. Wyeth Research Foundation and Library. I'd just like to say that Gloria prefers to take questions at the end. If you will, anyone listening will put them in the chat. We will get to them towards the end of the program. Once again, thanks for coming. Without any further ado, though, I'll turn the program over to our speaker, Gloria Greis.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Here we go. Fame is fleeting. I worked, as Carol mentioned, for many years at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and George Peabody of Danvers, Massachusetts, was a financier and philanthropist who made major donations to educational institutions in the US and to public education and housing in his adopted London. At the time of his death in 1869, he was arguably the most famous man on the two sides of the Atlantic. And yet today, there are probably very few of you on this call, if any, who could tell us who George Peabody was. Maybe residents of Danvers or Peabody, or any stray Londoners out there. I'm not even sure I could tell you who John Harvard was. So trying to make a list of notable Needhamites, I came up against a similar conundrum. Famous now, famous then. Famous here or famous out there? What about not famous but important anyway? And how do you judge relative famousness? Needham in his 310 and counting years has been fortunate. So I had a lot of names to choose from. My initial list ran to 3 pages, and my first draft of this talk was headed for a duration of 4 hours. So some serious choices had to be made. In the end, I decided to leave out the people who lived here, but whose primary contributions were made elsewhere. People like Dr. Thomas Huckle Weller, involved in the development of the polio vaccine, or Ananda Coomaraswamy, the mystic and curator at the MFA, who introduced West Asian art to America and Europe, or William T.G. Morton, who pioneered the use of ether in surgery. I opted instead for locality, the names that we see every day. Even so, there are many names missing here whose contributions to our town were important and who might well have been included. So here follows an entirely subjective and definitely not all-inclusive list of notable Needhamites. Okay, there are some names that come up so often and in so many contexts that there was not much question that they would make the list. These were the people who ticked all of the boxes, famous both here and there, now and then, and still important to our history and beyond. So in no particular order, I will start with William Nehoyden, or Nehatton, which is his proper name. His name has been transcribed more than 20 different ways in the various records he appears in, In the Dedham and Needham record, he is Nahoyden, which is probably less correct than most of our other options, but we will stick with it for now because it is the most recognizable around here. Nahoyden was a member of Reverend John Eliot's Native American convert community known as the Praying Indians. Needham is a partial claim to Eliot because the Praying Indian village of South Natick was part of Needham until after the Revolutionary War. Nahoyden's family converted when he was a small child, and he was taught to read his Bible in English, and he became a preacher and a schoolmaster in his home at Punkapug. Eliot, however, whose mind was broader than most in his day, sought to translate the Bible into Algonquian, the language family of the Native Americans in this area. Nahoyden was one of the men who worked with him to create a grammar book and an alphabet for their language, and then worked with him to translate the Bible. Nahoyden was also a negotiator sent by Eliot to try unsuccessfully to defuse the tensions that led to King Philip's War, and who later assisted Eliot with running provisions and supplies to the internment camps at Deer Island during the war. He was also a scout for the British during the war. After the war, Nahoyden acted as a representative for several of the remaining Praying Indians in lawsuits before the General Court, and as a negotiator for many of the land deeds that transferred ownership of native land to the English. Among these was the deed in 1680 that sold Nahoyden's own land to the town of Dedham, now the land on which Needham and Wellesley are located. This is the event depicted in our town seal. William Carter was a knitter and the founder of the William Carter Company. He pioneered the union suit, and small children are still wearing Carter's footy pajamas. But to Needham, Carter was not only a business owner, but also a philanthropist and politician. We'll start with the business. William Carter came to the United States in 1856, having left his home in Alfreton, Derbyshire, England, to find a better life. He had been one of the many handloom knitters in the English Midlands who were thrown out of their livelihood by the industrialization of the British textile industry. Like many, he emigrated, and he came to Needham because he knew people here. In Needham, he set up his handloom in his home, brought over his wife, and began a new business. It was successful enough that in a few years, he was able to buy a second house and move the workshop out of his home. In 1864, fewer than 10 years after he arrived in Needham, Carter went into partnership with his friends Mark and John Lee and built his first factory on the corner of West Street and Highland Avenue. The factory expanded rapidly, and by 1900, he built a second mill on Rosemary Lake, and then a third in Springfield, and more to come. He also invested in real estate, building himself a nice new home on Alfreton Road, which he laid out and named for his hometown, as well as several fine houses for his sons and then his grandsons. In addition to his business and real estate investments, Carter spent a great deal of his money on Needham. He had a great deal to spend, unlike some of the older Yankee families in Needham who were wealthy in land. Carter had a retail business and was wealthy in actual cash, arguably the wealthiest man in Needham. He donated the first public library, the land for the current public library, land for the Methodist Church and its parsonage, and assisted the Episcopal Church in its foundation, among others. He served on the school committee for 11 years, selectman for 3 years, water commissioner, and library trustee. Although all of Carter's sons were employed in the business, 2 of them, William Henry and Horace, would eventually succeed him as president. William H. and Horace also had distinguished outside careers. Horace was a member of the Governor's Council, and William H. served in both the Mass General Court and the U.S. House of Representatives. William H. is credited with the vote that passed the Women's Suffrage Amendment in 1919 that sent it out to the states for ratification. The Carter family owned the company until 1990, when it was sold to a public corporation. It has continued to grow, purchasing Oshkosh in 2005, and is now the largest manufacturer of children's clothing in the world. William Emerson Baker was born in Roxbury, the son of a not very successful businessman. Without the money for much schooling, Baker went out to work at a young age. He was clever, mechanically minded, and very entrepreneurial, as we would say these days. And he parlayed his low-end job into a pretty decent earning prospect. After a few years, he took his earnings and invested them in a partnership with a local tailor named William Grover to form the Grover and Baker Sewing Machine Company. Sewing machines were new at the time. And Grover and Baker formed just at the beginning of the shift to industrialization. So with their clever marketing and the sharing of patent agreements between the other growing companies such as Singer, Baker became extremely rich. Being rich at the age of 40, Baker retired to pursue his other interests. He bought 800 acres in the southwest corner of Needham and built out a summer estate that became legendary for its innovation, variety, and frankly, pure eccentricity. He created beautiful landscapes, but also an array of odd and sometimes disturbing vignettes, follies, tricks, and practical jokes. He spent a great deal of money in creating amusements for himself and his guests. But it was not all fun and games. Baker was interested in mechanics, in history, in metaphysics, and politics. He worked to support Southern Reconstruction. He was an early donor to the foundations of MIT, the Boston Natural History Museum, and the first Boston Aquarium. His primary cause was public health, and he advocated for training in scientific and sanitary food preparation standards and for cleanliness in the raising of livestock. He espoused the then radical notion that preventing infection and disease in the first place was a better strategy than trying to cure the disease afterward. In his later years, he tried to secede his estate from Needham and create a tax-free hygienic village that he called Hygeria. He argued that the savings to the state from the public health discoveries at Hygeria would save far more than he would pay in taxes. This is, of course, a justification for the modern nonprofit corporation, but he was far ahead of his time in that as well. Needham, led by his nemesis, Selectman William Carter, turned down his proposal. Baker was furious and threatened to sell up and move to a more congenial location, but he died of a heart attack shortly afterward at the age of 60. Leslie Bradley Cutler was a one-woman engine of the 20th century, a suffragist, community activist, selectman, state representative, senator, and aviator, and a public servant in the most generous sense. She was a crusader for mental and public health, an activist in the women's suffrage movement, an outspoken champion of welfare and penal reform, juvenile needs, education, and aviation. She began her 44 years of public service in 1924, only 4 years after women got the right to vote. Cutler was born in 1890 in Boston. She graduated from Radcliffe College and studied biology and public health at MIT. She ran for selectman, her first public office, in 1924, and was elected with the support of newly registered women voters. She was Needham's first female selectman and only the second female selectman in the Commonwealth. In those days, they were selectmen, even when they weren't men. 2 years later, she was also elected to the town's Board of Health, in which she served for 41 years. She was elected to the Mass House of Representatives as a Republican in 1938, and 10 years later, she ran for the state Senate and won, becoming only the second woman in state history to occupy a Senate seat. One of her most substantial accomplishments was her pivotal role in passing a bill to permit women to serve on juries. Her efforts consistently failed until after World War II, when it had become evident that women were able to fulfill men's jobs. As chairman of the Special Legislative Committee on Mental Health, Senator Cutler passionately fought for the passage of a bill which established community mental health centers. After taking flying lessons in 1942, she advocated for the funding to transform Logan Airport into the major terminal that it is today. And she also advocated for turning the meadow near Olin College into an airstrip, which I think, fortunately, in the long run didn't happen. She was also president of the Needham Community Council for 28 years, the director of the Needham Red Cross, and a member of the Needham Republican Town Committee. She founded local chapters of the YMCA and Freedom House in Needham and helped to start the Needham Council on Aging. In 2000, she was named Needham's Outstanding Person of the 20th Century by the Needham Historical Society for these astonishing accomplishments. Newell Convers Wyeth, N.C. Wyeth, was born in 1882 at the family's home on South Street. His father, Andrew, was a hay merchant in Charlestown, and his mother, Henriette, was a daughter of the Swiss botanist Denny Zerngiebel. Zerngiebel is also of interest to us as the inventor of the giant Swiss pansy, Needham's Pansy King, and the reason we celebrate Pansy Day every year. Wyeth showed his artistic talent at an early age. This talent thrilled his mother, who wanted him to be an important man and not a hay merchant. But it did not thrill his more practical father, who wanted him to be a farmer. NC had zero interest in being a farmer or even a hay merchant. Unlike his brothers, he did not attend Needham High School. He was first sent to the Mechanic Arts School in Boston, but soon transferred to the Massachusetts Normal Arts School, which is now the Mass College of Art. In 1902, he left Needham, accepting an invitation to study with the great illustrator Howard Pyle in Wilmington, Delaware. Wyeth married Carolyn Bacchius of Wilmington in 1906, and they settled in nearby Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. They had 5 children, 3 of whom, notably their son Andrew, became artists as well. Wyeth's career as an illustrator took off with significant commissions for magazines, books, public murals, and the famous series of illustrated classics published by Scribners in the 1920s. He became one of the most successful and recognizable illustrators in America. This was a problem for him, however. His success at illustration fed his family and made him rich, but he felt that it was a lesser skill than artist, and he aspired to be an artist. In his later years, he experimented with different styles, Impressionism and something verging on Surrealism. The one on the left is it's actually a Needham, a seat in Needham of a road, which you could see it's much more impressionistic than his illustration style. And the one to the right is something called In a Dream I Met George Washington, in which he's on his painting scaffold, painting a mural of George Washington, and George turns around to speak to him. He never really settled into this late style, however. Wyeth died in 1945 at the age of 63, when the car he was driving on stalled on a train track at a crossing near his home. In his life, he painted over 3,000 pictures and illustrated 112 books. He created some of the most iconic and well-loved images in American illustration, and he launched the artistic careers of 3 of his children, founding a true dynasty of American painters. Sunita Williams was born in Ohio and moved to Needham as a child. She was already interested in math and science when she attended the Hillside School and excelled in those studies at Needham High School, where she graduated in the class of 1983. She also studied Russian, which turned out to be very useful in the long run. After graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1987, she trained as a naval aviator deployed with the Helicopter Combat Support Squadron in various locations, including deployments for Operation Desert Shield and Operation Provide Comfort, and later to Florida as part of the Hurricane Andrew relief effort. She was selected for the United States Naval Training Test Pilot School in 1993 and for NASA's astronaut training program in 1998. She joined the crew of the International Space Station for her first space assignment in December 2006, returning to Earth in June 2007. At the time, her 192 days in space were a record for spaceflight for a woman, and I believe it still stands as second. She had a second tour on the International Space Station from July to November 2012, serving as the station's commander. In September 2015, Sunita Williams became one of the first members of the Commercial Crew Development Program, a NASA-administered partnership with SpaceX and Boeing to develop private commercial transportation vehicles for the space station. In August 2018, she was assigned to the first mission flight of Boeing's CST-100 Starliner and a third stay on the space station. Over the years, Sunita Williams has stayed in touch with Needham, and especially with the schools, even communicating with Needham students during her first space station tour. She also took a Needham flag into space, which she later presented to the History Center. In 2017, the school committee voted to name the new elementary school after her. As a naval officer and a pilot, Sunita Williams has set records and broken new ground, not only for women, but for everybody. She also has an exemplary record in public service and humanitarian relief efforts. As an explorer, scientist, and alumna of the Needham schools, she inspires our children to pursue their ambitions and reach, quite literally, for the stars. Arts and leisure, no politics, science, or religion. These are a couple of people whose talents created beauty and gave us pleasure. Alvin Fisher. As you travel south along Central Avenue into Dover, you pass a small street called Fisher Street. and then cross over an ancient and very narrow bridge whose official name is Fisher's Bridge. Given the logic of place names in old colonial towns, you can be sure that you are crossing land that once belonged to the Fisher family. The Fishers are among Needham's oldest families and signers of the petition that separated Needham from Dedham in 1711. Although the family overall was important in Needham, two of its members are famous worldwide: the artist Alvin Fisher and his brother, Dr. John Dix Fisher. And I'll get to John Dix Fisher later. Alvin Fisher was the fourth of the six sons of Aaron and Lucy Fisher and was born and raised on the Fisher Street property. At the age of 18, he moved to Boston to apprentice with the painter John Rideau Penniman, an apprentice of Gilbert Stuart and the designer of the seal of the city of Boston. At the age of 20, he opened his own studio in Boston, and from his studio, he painted portraits, animal portraits, decorative panels, and was a pioneer in American landscape painting. Fisher moved his family back to Dedham in 1850 and established a new studio. There, his work focused on landscapes, primarily of New England and New York State. Fisher's use of light and his preference for scenes of wild nature mark him as one of the earliest painters in what became known as the Hudson River School. He died in Dedham in 1863 and is buried in the old cemetery. The Needham History Center owns one of his landscapes, Fisherman by a Waterfall. Ali Raisman's impressive feats at the 2012 and 2016 Olympics capped her medal-winning career as a gymnast. She had been in national and international competitions since 2009, and between 2009 and her retirement in 2017, she won gold medals not only at the Olympics, but also the World Championships and the Pacific Rim Championships. And with it all, she managed to complete her high school work and graduate with her class in 2012. She is the third most decorated gymnast in American history, behind Shannon Miller and Simone Biles. In retirement, Ali Raisman has been working with her former gym to design training programs. She's also part of an organization that works to prevent sexual abuse of children and was an important witness for the prosecution of Larry Nassar, for which she shared an Arthur Ashe Courage Award. These are scientists, innovators and scientists whose contributions we still draw on today. John Dix Fisher, Alvin Fisher's younger brother, chose another equally successful path. He graduated from Brown University in 1820 and with the help of his brothers completed his MD in 1825 from Harvard Medical School. Upon graduation, he accompanied brother Alvin to Paris, where he studied the progress and treatment of smallpox and also visited the first school for blind children and observed their methods for teaching, including the use of raised type. Returning to America, Fisher began raising funds to open a similar school for blind children in the Boston area. With support from friends and family and a grant from the Massachusetts legislature, he was able to convince his friend, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, to join him in founding the New England Asylum for the Blind, now Perkins School for the Blind. Howe acted as director with Fisher as vice president and school doctor. Throughout his career, John Dix Fisher was an advocate for medical reform, introducing many of the French discoveries to American medicine, including the use of the stethoscope and the endoscope as diagnostic tools. He was a firm believer in the necessity for gathering statistical data as a means of identifying trends in disease and treatment, and was one of the founders of the American Statistical Association. The subsequent systematic collection of health information and vital statistics made possible major advances in public health and preventative medicine in the 19th century and still today. Dr. Vesta Miller practiced medicine at a time when very few women were doctors. Her father was a teacher and her mother was a member of the clergy. She started out as a teacher in the public schools at the very young age of 16, but her main interest was medicine. She attended the New England Female Medical College in Boston and the Medical College of Ohio in Cincinnati. She received her MD from the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Boston, and then attended the New York Postgraduate School of Medicine, where she received special training in surgery and treatment of the diseases of women. Dr. Miller came to Needham in 1876 with her husband, Dr. Albert Miller, a dentist. And you can see the two of them, they look like they're torturing that poor woman, but they're in fact extracting a tooth, which I guess in those days was torture. She practiced medicine here and in Boston for more than 30 years. Vesta Miller was strongly devoted to the cause of temperance, and she was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Needham from its founding in 1886 until her death in 1908. The small pocket park where Harris Avenue runs into Needham Avenue is called Vesta Park in her honor. Dr. Josiah Noyes was the first trained medical doctor to practice in Needham. He was born in Acton and educated in medicine and chemistry at Dartmouth College. In 1825, he moved to Needham and lived here for the remainder of his life. Dr. Noyes was a natural scientist in the broadest sense. In addition to medicine and pharmacology, he studied languages, theology, meteorology, botany, ornithology, and geography. He organized the Needham Lyceum, the Needham Anti-Slavery Society, and Needham's temperance efforts, and was a founder of the Congregational Church in Needham. An ardent abolitionist, Noyes used the Needham Lyceum to promote the cause. Noyes had a protege, Timothy Otis Fuller. Fuller was born into a family that had settled in this area in the 1600s and was one of the incorporators of the Needham Historical Society. He was an accountant by day, but in real life and in spirit, he was a naturalist who studied plants, birds, and reptiles. His knowledge was based on patient and minute observation. He was a tireless walker, and most of his rambles took place in Needham, where he examined every brook, woodland, and corner. Fuller's main accomplishment was his observation of Needham's birds that he kept in 4 journals, painstakingly compiled and revised from 1904 through 1912. He recorded detailed species comparisons, notes on habitats and behavior, and yearly notes of where he saw each species, how many he saw, and what date each year they were first seen. And these beautiful illustrations were also his own work. This priceless census record can be compared to current data to evaluate the changes in local climate and habitats over the last 100 years. And together, Noyes and Fuller made extensive collections of plants throughout Needham. The Needham History Center has 2 of Noyes' herbaria pressed into books, but the 2 men also made a systematic collection of local flora for scientific study. The Noyes-Fuller collection is considered to be the largest collection of floral samples from New England. It has been used for studies of local climate and habitat change, revealing that more than 40% of local species present in the 19th century are now locally extinct or endangered. The systematic collections were given by Fuller to the New England Botanical Club and now reside in the Harvard University Herbaria. The town fathers, they prayed over us, they governed us, they defended us. They are the mechanics that maintain our town structure. When Needham was established as a separate town in 1711, the first order of business was to build the meeting house. By Massachusetts law, the legal definition of a town was a church, a school, and sufficient tax revenue to pay a minister. The center of the new town was near the intersection of Central and Great Plain Avenues, which were the main coach roads at the time. The meeting house was built at the corner of Nahoyden Street and Central Avenue. Selection of the minister was a priority in a time when spiritual concerns were paramount, and the separation of church and state was unheard of. The minister was the leader of the community. The selectmen held the civil authority, but even their decisions deferred to the church. The parish took nearly 9 years to select a minister. Jonathan Townsend was just 22 years old when he was called to the pulpit in 1720. He just graduated from Harvard College and married Mary Sugars of Nantucket when he agreed to lead the parish for a small annual salary of 80 pounds plus firewood, which, by the way, Needham almost never paid. His father-in-law built him a house, still standing at 980 Central Avenue, and he remained as minister in the parish for the next 43 years until his death in 1762. He saw Needham through the early years of establishing a town, which in those days was not necessarily a given, through the spiritual crisis of the Great Awakening, the physical crises of epidemics, and helped to establish a community that would survive now for more than 310 years. The small park at the end of Nahoyden Street in the Old Center is called Townsend Green. Reverend Stephen Palmer was the parish's third minister, following Townsend and Reverend Samuel West. He graduated from Harvard in 1789 and was called to the pulpit in Needham in 1792, serving as minister for the next 30 years. He was also a schoolmaster, and the History Center owns some of his copybooks. Reverend Palmer was also an historian, a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and contributed articles to its publications. He was minister in 1811, the year of Needham's centennial, and wrote what became known as the Century Sermon, which included the first written history of Needham. Colonel William McIntosh was born in Dedham and moved to Needham in the mid-1760s. He married Abigail Whiting in 1745, and they were the parents of at least 7 sons and 3 daughters. He died in Needham in 1813 at the age of 90 and is buried in the Needham Cemetery. McIntosh served as a colonel in the 1st Suffolk Regiment during the Revolutionary War, fighting at Dorchester Heights, Castle Island, Fishkill, and other parts of the New York campaign. He also served Needham as a delegate to the 3rd Provincial Congress and as representative to the General Court for 5 years between 1775 and 1783. Locally, he served as selectman for 12 years between 1767 and 1792. It is said that he knew George Washington, and that George Washington called him out by name when the president visited Needham during his tour of 1789. Many towns have claimed acquaintance with George Washington, but we have some evidence that in our case, it was true. The colonel's family owned, until they gave it to the History Center, a relic known as the Washington kerchief, a rare gift that Martha Washington gave to the general's supporters. Judge Emery Grover was born in Newton in 1842 and came to Needham as a young man. He was a trial justice in the Norfolk District from 1868 to 1898 and became the presiding justice of the District Court of Northern Norfolk from its formation in 1898 until his death in 1920. In Needham, he was town council, a member of the school committee for 23 years, and town moderator for 37 years. He was also a member of the Town Hall Building Committee, the committee to create a town seal, and the town's bicentennial celebration committee, and a trustee of the Needham Cemetery Association. An active and very busy man. The present Needham Public Schools Administration Building, which was Needham's original high school, was named in his honor in 1935. Many of you knew Jim Powers, and for those of you that didn't, Jim was one of Needham's most engaged citizens and most important policy advisors. In 1943, Jim joined the Marines fighting in the Pacific at the Gilbert Islands in Okinawa. After the war, he graduated from Harvard and studied history, government economics at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. He later joined the Commonwealth's Legislative Research Bureau, retiring as chief research analyst in 1988. Jim's first town appointment came in 1950 to the Salary and Wage Board, and until 2011, he served on 14 town committees, including several that revised the town's charter or bylaws. But the longest position Jim held was as town meeting member, to which he was first elected in March 1951. He loved town meeting, which he saw as the purest form of American democratic self-government. Along the senior member, he served continuously for 61 years, the longest serving member in the town's history. In September 2010, the Board of Selectmen accepted the recommendation of the Needham Historical Commission to name the renovated Town Hall Auditorium as the James Hugh Powers Hall to honor his long and distinguished service. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that 2 currently serving governors, Charlie Baker of Massachusetts and Phil Murphy of New Jersey, were born and raised in Needham. Both graduated from the high school in the class of 75, and both then went on to Harvard. Baker started his career with the Mass High Tech Council, went on to serve in the cabinets of Governors Weld and Cellucci, then became CEO of Harvard Vanguard. He succeeded Governor Deval Patrick in 2015. Murphy had a long career at Goldman Sachs before becoming ambassador to Germany under President Obama. He succeeded Governor Chris Christie in 2021. And now to wrap up, here are a few more familiar names, all of whom deserve more mention, but we will go quickly. William Mitchell. Dr. William Mitchell practiced medicine in town for over half a century. He was a member of the Board of Hospital Trustees and of the Board of Health. He was also a school committee member and donor of the land on which Mitchell School stands. Shortly after his death in 1949, it was announced that the new elementary school would be named in his honor, and the school opened in 1951. Jonathan Avery was considered the founder of Needhamites until Highland Avenue was extended in 1866. The Heights was agricultural and not connected by a paved road to Needham Center. Avery, who owned land in the Heights, assisted with the settlement of knitters in the town and the development of the knitting mills, and generally fostered its industrial and residential development. The Avery School, now apartments, was built in 1869 on land purchased from Jonathan Avery. Timothy Dwight, 1630 to 1718. Timothy Dwight of Dedham was a town recorder, selectman, and deputy to the general court. And in 1711, when Needham separated from Dedham, he gave the town 34 acres of land in Dover for the benefit of the Needham schools. The Dwight School, named in his honor, replaced the old Center Schoolhouse in 1878 and closed in 1981. And the building is now part of the Charles River Center. William Pollard was principal of Needham High School from 1927 to 1956. Old students remember him as Skip, an avid and skilled tennis player, and as a man who rode a bicycle everywhere because he never learned to drive. The Pollard School was named after him in 1958, which was the first time that a Needham school was named after a living person. He died in 1960 at the age of 69. And finally, Durwood Newman. Durwood Newman was superintendent of Needham schools from 1944 to 1960. Newman Junior High, now Newman Elementary, was named after him when it was built in 1962. When Dr. Newman resigned from his Needham position, he became secretary of the Massachusetts School Association. So, fame may be fleeting, but there are things that are worth remembering. The people that I mentioned today shaped our town by their hard work and their service. We commemorate their contributions because we are grateful for what they did in their time and what they have done for us today. I mentioned at the beginning that my initial list was long. In fact, I was truly amazed by the number of names that I came up with off the top of my head, even before I started looking more deeply. And I know I missed a lot, more than a lot. These are folks who have made this town work and work well for more than 300 years. There are people whose contributions extended beyond the town to enrich our country. There were whole topics I didn't even get into because it was impossible to encapsulate them in this format, like abolition or suffrage, or the sacrifices of veterans and public servants and modern entrepreneurs. Whether or not we talked about them today, or whether we could even remember their names, we have built on their efforts and we owe them our gratitude. It's our turn to follow in their footsteps, and it's our turn to be notable. Thank you so much for joining us today. Because we are in the webinar format, as Carol mentioned, we will be taking questions through the chat box. And you will either see this as chat on the bottom of your screen, or if the more tab with dots if you've got a narrower screen. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Okay.
Questions.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
There have been so many things that just, you accept, well, this is the name of this school or that school or this street, or without really stopping to consider that these were people that we need to know more about. I've often been curious, but not curious enough. So I'm asking today.
Well, it struck me, I think, most strongly. I was fortunate to be on the committee that chose the name for the Sunita Williams School. And you sort of make your initial list and go through, what the various contributions of these individuals were and what it is about them you want to commemorate. And it really makes you think about, sort of how many people have contributed to the town, the things that they have done. And you're sort of winnowing through, how they relate to the given situation. But yeah, I mean, naming a property is a significant honor, and over the many years, it's taken a lot of thought.
Yeah. So I'm going to just, there's just a couple of questions so far. So let me just forge ahead with those. Rose Doherty asked whether you could talk a little bit more about Freedom House in Needham. I'm not familiar with that, so is that something you can help with?
I can't, no, I'm not right now. I'm not, no.
Okay. Continued.
Sorry, Rose, I'll find out for you.
Another question from Karen Z is, and I think the answer is no, but you can tell us more. Is Cutler Park named after Leslie Bradley Cutler?
Yes, yes, it is.
I thought it was after her son. No, anyway, so I guess I've learned something. Thank you. And something else. And another, just a comment from the same Karen Z. Did you know that the first painting you showed by N.C. Wyeth was given to Mrs. Jacobs, the third grade teacher at Broadmeadow School, by your students and families in 1990?
Yeah, the giant was actually a mural done for Westtown School in Pennsylvania. The original is actually quite a large painting. It was done as a commemorative for one of its students who had recently passed away, and he was a friend of Wyeth's, and the school commissioned the painting. But it's probably one of his most reproduced images, and certainly one of my favorites, is why I put it in there. But yeah, it's an amazing painting, and it is probably one of the most frequently copied, frequently reproduced.
Let's see if there's anything else. If not, I'm going to.
Jen Bello asked who the Eliot School was named after. Eliot School was named after the Reverend John Eliot. I mentioned him briefly when I spoke about Nehoyden, but as I said, South Natick was one of the praying Indian villages, and it was a part of Needham until 1789, I believe, right around then. It went back and forth. It was actually in dispute between Needham and Natick for a while. So Needham does claim the village and John Eliot, and as I said, Nehoyden. Hi, Carol. Thank you. Carol Frady asks, which houses in the Heights belong to the Carter family? All of them. I live actually at the corner of Spring and Webster, and the street directly across from us is Alfreton Road, which Carter laid out. There were two houses right on the corners of Alfreton and Webster with turrets. Those were both Carter houses. Those were for grandchildren. I believe the one on the corner of Mark Lee was also one of his. If you travel down Alfreton Street and make the turn, there's a very beautiful sort of arts and crafts, greenish arts and crafts house, which was the house for one of his sons. That beautiful house on the corner of Greendale and High Street with the porte cochere was William H's house. The house on it's next to it's on the corner of Alfreton and Highland, next to the congregation, next to the Methodist church. It's yellowish and has awnings and a tower, and that was son Horace's house. John had a house, son John had a house on the corner of Tower Road. He owned a lot of real estate. He built a lot of these houses, and then characteristically held on to the leases. So he owned the houses until actually he died, and then he willed the properties to his sons. But in my neighborhood, certainly a lot of the houses, especially characteristically houses with turrets, sort of that second story round room, were Carter houses, houses that Carter owned and built for his family.
Next question.
Anna asks, yes, Leslie Cutler was married. She's married to a guy named Roger. They did get divorced, but they had 3 children and an adopted child between them, and 2 of their sons went to the Olympics in 1936, and were among the boys in the boat. They're rowers on the Olympic rowing team.
Wow.
Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, the painting of the road. Oh, that's such a beautiful painting.
It is.
Okay, so not the giant, but the painting of the road that I showed in the second slide. Wyeth came back. So I said he moved to Chadds Ford he moved to Howard Piles in Wellington in 1902, then to Chadds Ford in 1906 when he got married. In 1921, he decided, I mean, he was always homesick, and he decided that, he was successful and established enough. He was going to move back to Needham. So he bought his grandfather's house. He moved his family back to Needham, and they lived here for 2 years. So 1921 to 1923, he lived in Needham. He was actually very unhappy because the house had changed. The town had changed a lot in the last 20 years, and he wasn't comfortable with change. And his family, who had never lived here, totally hated it. So they lasted only 2 years. They went back to Chadds Ford and lived happily ever after. But in that time, he did a lot of paintings, and this was the time when he was experimenting with his with some of these new styles. So he did a lot of landscapes around Needham that are quite nice, around the roads and the Charles riverscapes on the Charles River. He did several paintings that show in various forms, either as subjects or as backgrounds, his parents and his grandfather's house and his parents' house, which were right next door to each other and still standing.
Oh, there are a few more here.
The most famous athlete before Allie Raceman. Well, now that depends. If you're a Bruins fan, a lot of Bruins seem to end up here. Derek Sanderson and Mike Milbury and others. Frank Malzone of the Red Sox lived here until he recently passed away. Olive Hasenfuss Spark is a Hall of Fame, a female track and field, is a member of the Women's Track and Field Hall of Fame. She was an Olympian as well. And then the coach, the women's gym coach at the high school for decades. Hockey player Robbie Fatorik was raised here. Steve Hauschka, the kicker for the Seagulls, for the Seahawks, was born here. Eric Johnson was with Cincinnati. San Francisco. Sorry, I got my husband's here coaching me on the. So we turned out a lot of athletes as well, but I would say for famousness, either Olivia Hasenfuss or Frank Malzone. But then I'm not a hockey fan.
Okay.
Becky King asks about Blacksmith's Pond. Blacksmith's Pond was part of a chain of lakes. We still have Rosemary Lake, but there were actually several others that linked Rosemary Lake to what's now Trout Pond or Sportsman's Pond on Great Plain Avenue. And after the war, during the housing boom in the 1950s, that whole area between Rosemary and Sportsman's Pond was filled to use as residential land, and there are these culverts that basically contain the water and drain them through. But Blacksmith's Pond was called that because blacksmiths need a water supply, and that stretch of Nohoyden Street actually had several blacksmith establishments. The house that's now a sort of pumpkin orange, the Luther Fuller House on Nohoyden, just about opposite Blacksmith, was a blacksmith's house, and there were several right around it, and the pond was right there across the street. So it was known as Blacksmith's Pond. Most of the blacksmiths kind of abandoned that area once the train came through in the mid 1850s, because there was a lot more iron in a train yard than in a horseshoe. And as the use of horses declined and the use of vehicles increased, that's where their livelihood was. So that stretch of Nehoyden Street, sort of between Parish Road and Lewis or May Street, which had been the hub of the blacksmith operations, declined.
Let's see.
Leslie Cutler's house. This actually is. Joan Johnson asked about Leslie Cutler's house at Ridge Hill. The Morse Bradley estate, the house at Ridge Hill that is actually on the verge of being demolished, but was used as a town property since the 1970s. Before that was actually a hunting lodge built by John Torrey Morse and then sold to a guy named J.B. Bradley. This was an error that lived on in our files for many, many years. But in fact, J.B. Bradley is not the father of Leslie Bradley Cutler. J.B. came from West Virginia. He was a coal baron. And as the coal strikes and things got a little too unpleasant, he sold up, decamped, and came to live up north. Leslie Cutler's father was a resident of Boston and remained a resident of Boston, never went to West Virginia to mine coal, and was not, in fact, the owner of the Morse Bradley house. That did make its way into our files, and I know for many years was part of our discussion about the property. And we've been trying to pull it, we've been trying to purge it ever since, but yeah, it does turn out to be an error. Carol Franey is happy that most of the Carter houses are still standing. I totally agree. They're beautiful houses and they're in our neighborhood.
I think we need to kind of wrap this up. It's 3:00, but I was going to say one last one. Perhaps, do you know any more that you could share about the house that Jim Powers used to live in? I believe it's right on Nehoyden.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, the house was, I mean, it was obviously taken down a couple of years ago and rebuilt, but there was a little cottage on that corner, if you remember, the corner of Lewis and Nehoyden, that Jim lived in. It had a couple of commercial entities before he rented it as a house. There was a barber shop, and it may have been a butcher shop or something else, but yeah, it was a barber shop for a while, and then he lived in it. Well, he lived in it for many decades because they sold the family's house was that beautiful house with the fence on at 40 Grant Street, but he didn't need a house that large, so they sold that, and he had this smaller house.
Well, Gloria, I want to thank you.
Okay.
There are a few questions, a couple that we didn't get to, but we have to end somewhere, and there's no end of questions anyway. So thank you so much for educating us all about these topics that are just points of curiosity until we start hearing more. Once again, I just wanted to remind everyone that the next MacIver program is March 20th, about mercury, the element, the story of that, and how it affects us today. Gloria, is there anything you would like to wrap up with?
No, just commenting that you guys know your athletes. I'm getting a lot of athletes in the
See that.
Yes, Milt Schmidt. I forgot Milt Schmidt. Tommy Heinsohn I didn't know about. Pam Fernandez I did know about, Paralympic gold medalist. Also, now I'm forgetting her name. Another female athlete. Woody Dumart I haven't heard of, but he was also Bruin. Yeah, this just seemed to be like a Bruin safe house. Thank you everybody so much. Feel free to email me at the History Center if you have any questions you want the answers to. I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gloria.
Thank you.